I grew up in the Midwest to parents that were as religious as they were politically conservative. I lived in a part of the country that was overwhelmingly red. That history informed my favorable view toward classic Edmund Burke-style conservatism, whose ideas are important to preserve and transmit to future generations. The bedrock ideas of conservatism, that institutions arrange themselves through experience, meaning that society is a vast and complex organism where changes happen organically, and no one person, or even a group, can wipe out a society's institutions and replace them with anything remotely comparable. So the only acceptable mode of political change is organic, not revolutionary, because each generation must realize they are the caretakers of society's assets, not the owners. Further, it's not intellectual brilliance that is called for in government, but rather a sound understanding of people, steadiness of character, and common sense with a dash of flair. And I think Trump has all three of these. These ideas have historically been adopted by conservatives, so by extension, conservatives generally hold, number one, affection and respect for social reality and the past from which it has developed. Two, a cautious attitude to change and a desire to see that change happens gradually. Number three, accepting the mixed motives of humans and a disbelief in their perfectibility. And number four, a deep and abiding respect for the rule of law. I believe in these things. But now, as it initially appeared that possible witnesses would be called to corroborate the charge that President Trump withheld aid from Ukraine in order to secure a political advantage for the purpose of his re-election, the defense switched tactics to make the outrageous claim that that is okay. That if a president merely believes that his re-election is in the best interest of the country, he is entitled to engage in any activity that will help him achieve that goal. So says defense attorney Alan Dershowitz. Did he really say that?
Every public official that I know believes that his election is in the public interest. And mostly you're right. Your election is in the public interest. And if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.
Wow. Dershowitz is now saying his comments were taken out of context. The fact is, he said what he said, and now he's trying to walk it back without walking it back. I strongly encourage people to watch his comments in full and judge for themselves. While he pays lip service to limits on abuse, he leaves room for no practical boundary. His comments are problematic for a couple of reasons. First, during the Clinton impeachment, Dershowitz acted for the prosecution and argued vehemently that no crime needs to be committed in order for an impeachment to move forward. Let's watch.
It certainly doesn't have to be a crime. If you have somebody who completely corrupts the office of president and who abuses trust and who poses great danger to our liberty, you don't need a technical crime.
But now he says that a crime must be committed. Here in the U.S., Lady Justice wears a blindfold, which represents impartiality, the ideal that justice should be applied without regard to wealth, power, or status. We cannot change our interpretation of the law based on who is being prosecuted. That isn't blind justice, it's blind partisanship. But let's put that aside and take him at his word that for the last 30 years that has been Dershowitz's belief, but as soon as he was hired by the defense team, he genuinely saw the light and realized the errors of his ways. Let's grant that. We still have the second problem, a bigger problem. The Senate refused to allow witnesses by concluding that withholding money to get Ukraine to announce they were investigating Biden is a legitimate use of power. If that is true, then there is almost no basis for a president to ever be impeached on the grounds of abuse of power. Some pundits claim a specific law needs to be cited and that abuse of power isn't a real thing. But the fact is that abuse of power is a real offense. It's part of common law and covers malfeasance in office and is what the founders of the country meant by saying that a president could be impeached for, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors. As an example, Governor Rod Blagojevich was impeached in 2009 for abuse of power while trying to sell the vacant Senate seat left behind when Obama became president. Although there was no specific law to cover this, it was more than clear this was an abuse of power. And there are plenty more historical examples. The reason why nearly all constitutional scholars, aside from Dershowitz, agree that impeachment doesn't require breaking the law is because these abuses of power can only be committed by the president, and so there are no specific laws on the books against them. Every possible abuse of power doesn't need to be spelled out in statute. But if we accept the absurd notion that anything the president does in the interest of his re-election is fair game, then we open ourselves to authoritarianism, a collapse of the rule of law, and a genuine corruption of democratic principles. If we accept that what Trump did was okay, then we must also accept that a president can withhold funds from every state until the governors of those states agree to publicly support the sitting president. This would just be considered another form of quid pro quo that would have to be considered legitimate according to Dershowitz. Or how about the idea that the president tells the Justice Department not to prosecute anyone that voted for him? This too is fair game under the rules. Or how about selling Alaska back to Putin? There is no law against that at the moment, so would that be a valid exercise of presidential power? No one could possibly believe that any of these actions are legitimate, but that's exactly the road we're headed toward. There are conservative ideas to which I'm more than a little sympathetic, and ideas which I abhor. The most egregious are those that weaken the institutions of government and relegate our legislative bodies to the functional equivalents of guests on the Jerry Springer show. If Trump did what he is accused of doing, which we'll never know since the Senate decided not to call witnesses, then his actions cannot be pardonable, regardless of his party affiliation. Irrespective that the Senate failed to convict on the articles of impeachment, Dershowitz's transparently indefensible line of reasoning cannot be allowed to permeate the thought process of our nation's policymakers. If we allow this bastardization of conservative principles to guide our thinking, then we deserve the country that evolves as the byproduct of our decisions. But our children deserve better than a society run purely by self-interested partisanship and small-minded technocrats. So let's give them something better.